Hello, my name is Bob Nielsen. I'm the Extension Corn Specialist at Purdue University. This presentation, contrary to what you might be thinking as you read the title, is all about critical thinking and how to distinguish fact from fiction as we sort through all of the advertising and all of the claims that we deal with when we're making agronomic decisions about growing this crop. Now, the title refers to this figure speech that we often use in this country that refers to a person or a group holding some unquestioned belief, argument, or philosophy without critical examination, meaning that you just simply believe because it sounds good or because the person who told you the so-called fact is someone you trust and respect. And so we joke around about drinking the Kool-Aid. And so this presentation is about how to filter that Kool-Aid in order to make better agronomic decisions. So here's the deal. Farmers need crop inputs to produce the crops that generate the income that they need. And in return, companies sell them crop inputs, which generates income for the company. So, it's fair. However, farmers don't need every crop input that companies want to sell them. And furthermore, for the crop inputs that they do need, farmers often have alternatives to choose from. And the challenge with growing crops is that nothing is black and white. There's no single best set of solutions to use to maximize yield in corn. There's no miracle products. There's no silver bullets, okay? Every year, it's almost like we're starting from scratch, trying to grow this crop as best as we can. We know that maximum corn yield occurs while the seed is still in the bag. And in fact, we know from the kind of yields achieved in the National Corn Yield Contest that maximum corn yield potential is upwards of 500 or 600 bushels per acre. But once we plant that seed, then the seed and the young crop are exposed to a wide array of yield-limiting factors that threaten to reduce that yield potential. So this is the battle that we face every year as we grow a crop. Now, the simple secret to achieving higher yields in the future is figuring out why you're not achieving high yields today. And so in other words, it comes down to identifying and mitigating yield-limiting factors that are specific to the fields in your farming operation. And if we fail to identify and diagnose these yield-limiting factors, then some of the decisions we make on growing this crop will simply miss the mark. And we either waste dollars on crop inputs that we simply don't need, or we leave yield on the table because we failed to use crop inputs that we in fact needed and we just didn't know it. Or we lose out on both accounts. Now, the search for yield-limiting factors requires, obviously, some agronomic knowledge and skills. It takes a lot of time, and it can be pretty difficult to identify those specific factors in your fields that are holding yield back. But it is important because we should not be spending dollars on solutions for problems we don't have. Now think about what I just said for a little bit, and I'll repeat it. We should not be spending dollars for solutions to problems that we don't have. And the challenge is that there are plenty of folks out there who are willing to sell us solutions. Some of these are well documented with reliable research. Some of these solutions appear to be well documented, but in reality are not. Some of these so-called solutions rely primarily on farmer testimonials. And frankly, some of these so-called solutions are indeed simply snake oil products of no value to us whatsoever. And so the challenge is, how do we separate the wheat from the chaff? When we read the sales literature, when we look at information on the websites, when we read magazine articles, when we sit in meetings listening to so-called experts talking about what they do to grow these crops. In other words, what we're trying to figure out, what you need to try and figure out is, what is credible information and what is not? And that's why we say that we often need to filter the Kool-Aid before we drink it. And this involves use of critical thinking. It involves your improving your own knowledge so that you can do a better job of reasoning through some of the claims that you read. And this is the focus for this whole presentation. Now you might ask, how do we filter that Kool-Aid? Well, you do it by asking questions. One question is the information source credible? Are the claims that you're being given, are they plausible? Do they make sense? Is there data supporting the information that you're being provided? Where did the data come from? Did it come from a reliable independent source, or did it come from a company who is hoping to gain by you following what they say? Was the data interpreted correctly? And this can be challenging for those who are not experienced with research and not experienced with looking at data. And then finally, has anyone independently verified the claims? In other words, has someone else, other than the company you're listening to, has someone else verified the value of this input that you're considering? And understand that just because it makes sense does not mean it's true. Mark Twain has a saying that I like that refers to this. He supposedly said once, it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble, but rather it's what you think you know for sure that just ain't so. And how true is that? Is that sometimes we're just confident that we know the answer. We're confident we know what's right to be on growing this crop, and in fact, it just ain't so. We're constantly bombarded with advertising. Not just in agriculture, but in society as a whole. But nevertheless, the concepts of advertising are pretty similar. And one objective of advertising is to simply create product awareness. And take, for example, this really interesting three-dimensional kind of advertising on the side of a large semi-trailer in Europe. And the translation from the rear of that truck says tastes outstanding, and so they're promoting some kind of a drink. They're just trying to create product awareness. Now in agriculture, advertising often instills images of that product's value to agriculture. So here's an old advertisement from Mycogen. It's got several armored cars, armored trucks is what I'm trying to say. Several armored trucks on the edge of a cornfield. And of course, armored trucks carry cash, they carry gold bullion, they carry a lot of things of value. And so, okay, here's this image then of armored trucks carrying probably a lot of cash sitting next to a cornfield, and there's Mycogen's name emblazoned on the side of these armored trucks. And so, and the catch line that says, our hybrids pay off big at harvest. Well, clearly there's no data in this piece of advertising. The company is simply trying to instill this mental image of their hybrids creating value for you for corn production, okay? But no data at all. Testimonials are a form of advertising, and unfortunately, testimonials often don't include meaningful data that you can actually use to critically evaluate some claim or opinion. And in fact, some testimonials include no data whatsoever. Here's an example of a statement from an interview in a farm magazine with a couple of farmers about their opinion of split applying nitrogen fertilizer. And this is an example of a testimonial with no data. And this is taken verbatim from the farm magazine. So here's the statement from the reporter. While they didn't have comparison strips, they believe the split application approach helped. So read that carefully. They did not have comparison strips. That means they had no meaningful comparison of their split application of nitrogen fertilizers with whatever they were doing before. They just simply believe that the split application helped. This is not terribly useful from a critical evaluation perspective. We need to carefully read these testimonials and scrutinize them if they seem to include data. So here's another example from a farm magazine interview. with a grower who went whole hog and switched to a twin row planting system, probably switching from a 30-inch row system in the past. But he went whole hog and switched to a twin row planting system, and goes on to say that this year's harvest is showing that was a good choice. My yields are about 15% higher than average. So the testimonial seems to show data and refer to data. The farmer's yields are 15% higher than average. But if you look carefully at what is being said here, he went whole hog and switched completely to a twin row planting system, which means he probably did not have a 30-inch row comparison. And so while his yields might be 15% higher than average, it may simply because last year's weather, was excellent. All right, so carefully scrutinize these testimonials when they seem to have data. So when we talk about evaluating the credibility of the source, what we're sort of asking is, does the source have anything to gain by you trusting their advice or following their recommendations? In other words, do they sell the product that they're telling you to use, or do they consult for the seller? In other words, are they an independent source, or do they have something to gain? And so we often sort of attribute this or associate it with the fox and guarding the hen house. And so you just have to naturally be skeptical if the source that's giving you the information might gain financially from you following their advice. And so another aspect of determining credibility of the source is asking the question, do their recommendations, are they based on solid, extensive data, or are they simply based on logic? And we have to be careful with things that sound logical. And my colleague here at Purdue, Gary Steinhardt, if you know the man, I call him a humorist because he is full of these humorous sayings, almost like a Will Rogers or a Mark Twain. And so once upon a time, Gary shared this view with me about the hazards of logic. And he said, logic can be a systematic way of going wrong with confidence. And that is so true. And furthermore, logic often reinforces what's called confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is the tendency to process information by looking for or interpreting information that's consistent with our existing beliefs. And so, in other words, your preconceived notions about something can influence the data you look for, the sources that you read, or the information you gather, and it may influence how you interpret the results of trials and surveys. Consider the logic of this quote. Again, another Farm Magazine interview with a seed company agronomist. This is the actual quote from the article from the seed company agronomist about proven steps to improve corn yield. Okay, so this agronomist says that upping population by planting 4,000 more seeds per acre at current seed prices would cost about $14.89 per acre. And these 4,000 ears could add 28 bushels per acre. And he says even at today's corn price, that's pretty simple math and a clear-cut advantage for higher population. Pretty impressive. $14 an acre to up your seed cost, and you get 28 bushels back. Proven steps, according to the seed company agronomist, to improve yield. So, sometimes you need to think these things over a little bit. You need to mull through your head and sort of ask the question, does this sound right or not? And I'll offer you this checklist to be a critical thinker. So, the credibility of the source has to be a little questionable in this case because it's a seed company agronomist telling us that adding 4,000 more seeds per acre would be valuable. All right, so you have to be a little questioning on the credibility of the source. Is the claim plausible that you can increase yields 28 bushels by adding 4,000 more plants? Well, at best, it's questionable, and I'll give you an example of how to think this one through here in a bit. Is there supporting data? Well, in the Farm Magazine article, no. There was no supporting data whatsoever, so immediately the red flag should go up a little bit on that. And then finally, was the interpretation of the results correct? Well, we don't really know because there was no data provided in the Farm Magazine interview, and so we really can't decide whether the results were interpreted correctly or not. But nevertheless, let's go ahead and try to think this one through. All right. So the premise is that adding 4,000 more ears per acre will increase yields 28 bushel per acre. Right. That's the premise. So to do so, you can work through the math on this, and I've done it for you. To do so would require an average ear size of 16 rows around by 35 kernels per row, plus an average kernel weight factor of 80,000 kernels per 56-pound bushel. And in fact, this scenario is in fact plausible. And let me show you with the common yield estimation formula that we use when we're out estimating yields prior to harvest. If you have 4,000 ears times an average of 16 rows around times an average of 35 kernels per row, and you divide that by the kernel weight factor of 80,000 kernels per bushel, in fact, you get 28 more bushels of grain. Ear size of 16 by 35 is pretty typical, pretty average. And so technically, this premise of increasing yields by 28 bushel with 4,000 more ears is in fact plausible. But this yield increase of 28 bushel by increasing yields 4,000 plants, that is the same as saying that there's a linear yield increase of 7 bushel for every 1,000 plant increase in the field. And I ask again, does this sound plausible? And you may have a hard time deciding whether that sounds plausible, but remember, we're talking about adding 4,000 more plants per acre in a field that's probably already near or maybe even beyond the optimum population already. So when you think about it in that sense, it might raise a question as to whether it's plausible or not. Here's a graphical illustration of that assumption behind the claim of 7 bushels increase for every 1,000 plant increase in a field. And this data is completely made up, but it illustrates the point that I want to make. And so if you start at 16,000, and let's say it's 16,000 plants per acre, the yields are 150. If you add 4,000 more plants, and if you get 28 bushels per 4,000 plants, at 20,000 plants per acre, yields would be 178 bushel. And if you add another 4,000 and add another 28 bushel, you'd be at 206 bushels per acre at 24,000. And you can keep doing this forever. And if you take it all the way to 40,000, and if the assumption is in fact valid, by the time you get to 40,000 plants per acre, you'd be at 318 bushels per acre. This was what a linear yield increase would look like of 7 bushels per 1,000 plants. And just looking at the bushel numbers should make you question whether that claim of a 7 bushel per acre increase for every 1,000 plants is in fact plausible or not. And honestly, I don't think it is, because we've done an awful lot of work looking at yield response to population around Indiana. So this is the average corn yield response to population in more than 80 field scale trials that Jim Cambrato and I have done since 2008. This is the yield response. And so at 20,000 was the lowest that we've had in our trials, and we've gone as high as around 40,000. And it's we call it a flat yield response, okay? If you begin at 20,000 and add more population, we get about 3 bushels for every additional 1,000 plants. The agronomic optimum in our trials has been around 32,000 plants per acre. That's where you get maximum yield. If you continue adding plants, once you are at the agronomic optimum population, you do not get any more yield. And in fact, at some point, you begin to lose yield as you stress the crop with those higher populations. This is what corn yield response does in the real world. Well, then how does one arrive at a claim of 7 bushel per 1,000 plants? The best we can do at the low end of our population range is 3 bushel per 1,000. How does one arrive at 7 bushel per 1,000 plants? And as I thought about this, I realized there is a way to arrive at close to that number mathematically. And in the case of our trial, averaged over all of these 80-some trials, our average optimum yield has been about 190-some bushels of grain. And again, we're achieving that at 32,000 plants per acre. And so, mathematically, you could divide the 194 bushel by the optimum population of 32,000, and that equals 6 bushels per 1,000 plants. And one could interpret that to be a linear increase of 6 bushel per 1,000 plants. One could interpret it that way. It would be totally wrong. But I suspect this might be how the seed company agronomist arrived at this 7 bushel per 1,000 plants by doing some kind of similar math. But again, it just does not make sense. It is not plausible to think that adding 4,000 more plants would result in 28 bushels of grain yield, okay? So let's continue with this issue of talking about credibility of the source. So we talked about whether you can trust the source of the information, whether the recommendations are based on data or simply on logic. And then the next question we can ask is, how easily can you obtain the results of the trials? How easily can you get the data yourself and look at it to determine if the claims are plausible or not? Here's an example, a real-world example from a website of a product, which tells us that trials were conducted in 2016 in Iowa, Illinois, Tennessee, and Wisconsin with soybeans and corn that were treated with a foliar application of this particular product post-emergence. And the average yield response in soybeans was 7 bushel per acre. The average yield response in corn was 7.6 bushels per acre. And if you look close at this, you see a little asterisk. And at the bottom of this web page, it says data on file. And so they don't show the data on the website. In order to get the data, you have to send them an email. In this case, you filled out an online form to request the data. And of course, the downside of that is that once you send in a request with the online form that asks for your email address and possibly your phone number, now that opens up the door for sales pressure from this company. Well, I went ahead and did this. I filled out the online form. I asked for the data. I gave them my email. I didn't give them my Purdue email, but I gave them my personal email address. And I never got the data. It was just about ready to be published, I was told, and it would be a while. Eventually, I got sort of a results summary on this particular product, but as I perused it, it simply was not valuable. It was not, in my opinion, it was not good sound research data, and I had a hard time actually justifying the plausibility of this claim based on that. And so anyway, it's a challenge. And so even for researchers like myself, sometimes distinguishing between fact and fiction can be difficult. Sometimes getting a hold of the trial results or the actual data is hard to do. And then for when we do get it, sometimes the data, the equations, the charts, the tables, the statistics can be difficult to understand, or sometimes are simply misrepresented. So distinguishing fact from fiction can be difficult. So let's go through a couple of examples with you on that sort of illustrate this challenge or this issue of separating fact from crap, and so we'll practice with a few examples. This one goes back some years, and it was another web advertisement on a website about some field trial comparisons, comparing Corn Guy versus Gerber Superfine. Now, I've changed the names, all right, to protect the guilty. But this was an example of 73 Corn Guy field trial comparisons against Gerber Superfine in Indiana in 2007. And if you squint at the little map, you'll see an average yield response, yield difference of 14.4 bushels per acre. And so this was the upshot, was that Corn Guy brand hybrids with super duper technology consistently outyielded Gerber Superfine hybrids by 14.4 bushels per acre. Now, this is all the website really said. So my question was, what are they really trying to tell me? Are they simply saying that the super duper technology of the Corn Guy hybrids was better than the superfine technology of the Gerber hybrids? Or maybe they were simply saying that Corn Guy brand hybrids are simply better than Gerber brand hybrids, period. You really couldn't evaluate what they were telling you with this data that was being shown on the website, all right? So it's sort of in between fact and crap. I'm sure the data itself was factual, but I'm not sure what they were trying to tell me about it. Here's another example of a seed company showing or telling us that over 44,000 field trials demonstrates the standability advantage of their hybrids versus a competitor's leading hybrids. And they go on to say that a competitor's leading hybrids lodge nearly twice as much as our leading hybrids. And they show us the data where the company in question's hybrids were 97.6% standing at harvest, and the leading competitors were 96% standing. So the competitors were 4% lodged, and our hybrids, if you want to call it our hybrids, were 2.4% lodging. Is this fact or is it crap? Well, technically speaking, the message is factual. 4% lodging is nearly twice as large as 2.4%. So in that sense, the message is factual. But in a practical sense, I gotta say that I doubt that any farmer would really notice the difference between 96% standing and 97.6% standing corn at harvest. So while the message is factual, what they're trying to tell you with the advertising is, in my opinion, crap. It doesn't mean anything in the real world. All right, here's another example of fact versus crap. These are three starter fertilizers compared to no starter. And it's Gerber Superfine 918.9 versus no starter versus another company's Super Duper 918.9 versus traditional 1034.0 fertilizer. And so they're showing us the yields. And the first point I want to make with you is that there's something about the way this chart has been designed that is simply not appropriate from a research perspective. And it may not be obvious to you if you've not spent a lot of time looking at charts. But in this particular case, the chart begins at 142 bushel on the y-axis. And this is a classic snake oil ploy, because if you want to visually amplify small differences between treatments, well, then you start the y-axis on a graph at a pretty high number. And so visually, when we look at this graph, man, we see the stair step. Boy, it looks like some pretty impressive numbers. And if you fail to look at the actual legend of the y-axis, you might think there's some tremendous differences among these treatments, all right? So if instead of starting at such a high number on the y-axis, if you redraw the graph and start that y-axis at 0 like you're supposed to, well, then visually, the differences among these four treatments is much less impressive. And frankly, it's now realistic, okay? So that's the one key thing to watch out for when you're looking at charts in advertising or in research summaries is, look at these simple things like how are they designing the charts in the first place, all right? So here's the company claim. The company's claim was Gerber's Superfine Starter Fertilizer yielded better than its competition. Okay. Well, what do we make of this? Gerber's Superfine yielded 157.8 bushel compared to no starter at 155 bushel. Compared to Corn Guy's Super Duper 918.9 starter fertilizer at 153, and then the 1034.0 treatment yielded the least at 147.7. How do we interpret this? Is it fact or is it crap? Well, I've got fine print there near the bottom if you haven't read that yet. First of all, this was actual published data. All right, I didn't make this up. This is actual published data in advertising. It was one location. The number of reps were not stated, and the number of years of the trial were not stated. So while technically the claim is numerically correct, Gerber's 918.9 did yield more than the other treatments. However, among other things, they don't tell us what the rates were, the application rates of the other starter treatments. So we don't know if we're talking the same amount of nutrients in these other treatments. And because it's only one location and they don't tell us if it's only 1 year data, they don't even tell us if it was replicated data. Again, numerically it's correct, but you sort of have to put this more in the crap category because you just really can't trust the claim of what's being promoted here, okay? So ultimately, all of this comes down to not taking claims or advertising at face value, but rather go ahead and be a healthy skeptic, especially when a claim sounds too good to be true, and try to determine whether the information you have at your disposal is based on good, sound research and reliable data. And understand it's okay to be skeptical, all right? You've got a constitutional right to be skeptical. And if you need a carrying card, you can print this off and cut it down and put it in your billfold. But don't be afraid to be skeptical when you're looking at claims in advertising. Some more questions you can ask. Who conducted the research? This sort of is the same thing as asking about the credibility of the source. Where is the research conducted? If it was conducted in Idaho and you farm in Indiana, well, again, you need to sort of think twice about whether it's relevant to your situation. What were the treatment comparisons? Were they valid comparisons, in other words? Were the treatments replicated in the trial? We'll talk more about that here in a bit. How many trials were conducted? Is this a one-off, or do you have a lot of trials backing up that data? And then finally, were the data statistically analyzed? And so it's all about asking or seeking details. So here's an example of a common phrase that's used in the seed industry advertising, where they may say something like, our hybrid had 90% wins against the competition. The natural question that should be asked when you see something like this is, who was the competition? If it was against the worst of the competition, well then the fact that our hybrid had 90% wins doesn't mean a whole lot. And unfortunately, many times we are not told who the competitor hybrids were. And so anytime I see a phrase like this, I don't really pay much attention to it because it doesn't mean much to me. So how many trials were involved? And we ask this question because what we're really asking is, were the treatment effects consistent across all the trials? When we're making agronomic decisions about crop inputs, the goal is to identify crop inputs that will work for you most of the time, meaning inputs that will work across a wide range of growing conditions. So that's why we ask how many trials were involved and whether the treatment effects were consistent or not. Here's another common claim. Our product yielded 10 bushel better. Well, again, the natural question is better than what? Compared to doing nothing? If there's no valid comparison, it's really hard to critique this kind of a statement. So you always need to ask the question, what is it compared to? Consider this simple advertisement in the back of a popular farm magazine. It's been in farm magazines for years. There's a posi-close closing wheels, and if you look closely, they prevent crusting and baking, they destroy sidewall compaction, they improve crop emergence and stand, they increase seed to soil contact. All right. Now, this is admittedly a sort of a minor kind of advertising, but nevertheless, when they give you this claim of improving crop emergence and stand, increasing seed to soil contact, again, you have to ask, compared to what? Compared to using no closing wheels at all? What's it compared to? And without that idea of what the comparison was, you have no idea whether something is better or not. All right. Small kind of example, but nevertheless, it drives home the point. All right, so understand that research answers questions. And the question might be, does my hybrid have a better yield potential than yours? And you might take action by conducting a simple variety trial on your farm. And it could be that it turns out that my hybrid yielded 10 bushel better in that variety trial conducted on my farm. The fact that my hybrid yielded 10 bushel better than yours in that trial is an indisputable historical fact. And it clearly answers the question, which hybrid performed better in that particular trial, right? No one can dispute this, right? My hybrid beat yours in that trial. But that's not the point. The danger is that from that one variety trial, you might jump to the conclusion that my hybrid is in fact better than yours, that my hybrid indeed has a better yield potential than yours. And this can be dangerous, okay? And I hope you understand it's because it was only one variety trial conducted 1 year. And so we have to be careful jumping to conclusions when we run these individual trials, because the purpose of research is not to simply document what happened. That is not why we do research. The purpose of research is to predict whether the things we document in these field trials will occur again in the future and occur consistently. So in other words, what we're really asking is, will my hybrid beat your hybrid over and over and over again? Meaning, and if it does, it truly has better yield potential. All right, so research is trying to predict the future based on what's happened in the past. Now, we have to be careful, though, because just like the grain markets or the stock markets, historical performance does not necessarily predict future performance. And the yield differences that we measure between treatments and field trials always include some level of confounding effects of what we call background noise. And here's an example of a field with a lot of background noise. These are pockets of soil differences in the field that have varying degrees of drought stress. A lot of background noise. And field research is plagued by these confounding effects of other things in the field that are influencing yield and often camouflaging the effects of the treatments that we're interested in. And this background noise can be things like drainage differences, fertility differences, soil moisture differences, like in this field with drought stress, compaction, other subsoil characteristics, sometimes human error. But this background noise is variability that can occur among the plots in a trial and add additional yield effects that may mask over what we're really trying to see. Now, I will say, while this is a depressing image in one sense, it's actually sort of a pretty image, isn't it? All right, so let's conduct an experiment to try and drive this point home. We're going to do a simple experiment here. I'm going to do a comparison of 4 treatments that influence the color or shade of circles. All right, 4 treatments that influence the color or shade of circles. And I'm going to conduct this test in an environment that has little to no background noise, little to no other factors that influence color of these circles. All right, you with me on that? So here's the test environment. Nothing else in there that is colorful other than the blue arrow. And here are the results of the trial. Treatment A, treatment B, treatment C, and treatment D. So my question is, can you rank these treatment effects from darkest green to lightest green? And I suspect you can. Treatment A gave the darkest color green, then treatment C, then treatment B, and then treatment D. And if you repeat this experiment in the same kind of environment with no other confounding color background noise issues, you will always see these differences among these 4 treatments. Now, let's conduct a second experiment. This is similar to the first one. There will be 4 treatments that influence the color or shade of circles, but this time we're going to conduct the test in an environment that has a lot of other background noise that affects the color of objects. A little more challenging to detect differences among the treatments. Are you ready? Now I ask you, can you confidently rank these 4 treatments and their effect on the color of circles from darkest to lightest shade of color? I would dare say you cannot. In fact, you don't even know if they're still green circles or not. There's so much background noise in this environment of other things that's influencing color of objects, you just can't tell. And that is the whole point I'm trying to explain about excessive background noise in field trials that can mask the effects of treatments that we're interested in. And so what we're asking is, when we do measure differences among treatments, so-called differences, we're asking whether they're significant. Now, understand, the significant is a statistical term. I'm not talking about whether they're important. I'm talking about whether they're statistically significant. Technically, any apparent differences between treatments that we measure are in fact real because we measured them. But that's not really what we're asking. We're asking whether the observed differences are actually due to the treatments, or are they possibly due only to background noise or some blend in between. All right. Because of the background noise, researchers can never be certain that the yield differences we measure in a trial are solely due to the treatments we're looking at. And so the challenge is to conceptually filter out and separate the effects of the treatments from the yield effects of the background noise. That is the primary purpose for statistical analysis of data collected from field research. Now, as soon as I mention the word statistics, I know there's some eyes rolling because people have opinions about statistics, including Mark Twain. He said there are 3 kinds of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics. And another time, he said, first get your facts, and then you can distort them at your leisure. All right. So I know people have a lot of bad thoughts about statistics, maybe bad experiences from college statistics classes, but nevertheless, statistics are important for what we do in field research. Statistical analysis allows us to mathematically identify and conceptually isolate the background noise so that the true treatment effects are more clearly detectable. And it helps us decide with a known or stated probability of confidence whether the observed differences we see are in fact due to the treatments or not. This is why we do statistical analysis of data in the field. Now, let's talk about least significant difference, because you see this LSD value often on charts and tables. And so statistical analysis of replicated data sets allows us to calculate this LSD value, which we use to compare the yield difference between pairs of treatments in order to decide whether the yield difference we've measured is simply due to background noise or whether it's due to true differences between the treatments. The LSD value conceptually reflects the level of background noise in the trial. And so one way to think about this when you're looking at a table with LSD values is that a large LSD value translates to a trial that had a lot of background noise. And because of that, it's less reliable of a trial. Whereas a trial that has a small LSD value is one that had less background noise, and therefore it's a more reliable set of data. Okay? And so when we use these LSD values and compare the differences between pairs of treatments, treatment effects that differ by less than that value of the LSD are likely different purely due to random background noise, and not because the treatment effects were statistically significant or real. Whereas if the differences are greater than the LSD value, then we conclude that the treatment differences are in fact real. All right, we often talk about replicating or repeating treatments within a trial, and we do that, among other things, to simply allow us to do the math that helps us separate the true treatment effects from those due to background noise. At the very least, replicates help us determine whether treatment effects are consistent in that trial or repeatable throughout that trial. Because again, we're looking for repeatability, and that determines reliability of the agronomic choice made based on the data. We also you hear us talk about randomizing treatments in a field trial, and here's an example, a very simple example, where there are 3 reps in this trial, 1, 2, and 3, and there are 3 treatments in every rep. And if you look closely at the sequence of those 3 treatments in every rep, you'll see that they are not the same sequence. All right, they're randomized. And this treatment randomization simply reduces the odds that unforeseen spatial variability or background noise will unfairly influence some treatments over others. One example that might occur in a field situation is something like the effect of drainage tile patterns on individual plots within a trial. Plots that happen to lay over the tile lines are probably going to have higher yields in soggy years, whereas plots that happen to lie between the tile lines are probably going to have slightly lower yields because they're less favored by the tile drainage. And of course, this relationship may flip in a dry year. And so we randomize the plots to make sure that treatment 1 does not always lay on top of a tile line and treatment 2 does not always lie in between a tile line. That's one example of why we randomize the sequence of treatments. All right, so here's a made-up example, but nevertheless, it's an example of a table with 2 treatments, my stuff and your stuff, with an average difference of 20 bushel per acre. And when we throw this up on a screen and you see the 20 bushel per acre, you're tempted to get really excited about the difference between your stuff and my stuff. But then I go on to say, but hold on, there's this little NS behind next to the 20 bushel difference. And then if you look close, you'll see an LSD of 55 bushel. And so I say, hold on, this 20 bushel difference is not significant because of the large LSD. Well, most people raise an eyebrow when a researcher has the nerve to tell them that a 20 bushel difference is not significant, right? Remember, it's all about repeatability. It's all about the search for true treatment effects in the midst of a lot of background noise. And it's sort of our fault as researchers. We always show you the average differences in a trial. We never show you the individual replicates of data. So let's take a closer look at this example of your stuff and my stuff, with your stuff on average, beating mine by 20 bushel. Again, the LSD of 55 bushel. This large LSD value tells us that the treatment effects were not consistent among the replicates of the trial. In other words, there was a lot of other natural field variability out there influencing yield. All right, so let's show you what the individual reps look like. Or in the words of Paul Harvey, that some of you may remember, let's talk about the rest of the story. So this trial had 4 replicates. The average yield response was a 20 bushel difference, shown there on the left. But in rep number 1, your stuff did in fact beat mine, and it beat it by a lot. In rep number 2, it reversed, and my stuff beat your stuff by 25 bushel. In rep number 3, my stuff beat yours again. Now it's 2 out of 3 reps I beat your stuff. And the 4th rep, your stuff beat mine by a lot again. And on average, your stuff was 20 bushel better than mine. But look at the variability on how the treatments performed in the 4 reps. That led to the huge LSD of 55 bushel per acre. And even though there was a 20 bushel difference over the whole trial, averaged over the whole trial, your stuff did not consistently beat my stuff, and that's why we then conclude that this apparent difference of 20 bushel is not significant, and what we're really saying is it's not reliably different. Now, some people ignore the statistics and they look at a table like this with a 20 bushel difference. Even though I say it's not significant, they look at that and they step into this dollar trap. Some would argue, okay, at $4 corn, that 20 bushel difference equals 80 bucks an acre, and that's significant to me. And some of you may be thinking the same thing. I've got to tell you, you cannot do that. If the statistical analysis indicates that the yield difference is due primarily to background noise, it's not significant, then the correct conclusion is that the true difference between the treatments is actually 0. And so it just ain't right to take the 20 bushel and extrapolate it to dollars and cents, because if the data and the analysis say it's not significant, you have to conclude that the 2 treatments are actually equal in their effects on yield. Be careful and not stepping into that trap. All right, so let's talk about apples and oranges and that importance. Here's a replicated field trial that was established to compare the 2 treatments that you see. 30-inch row spacing at 33,000 seeds per acre and 20-inch row spacing planted at 40,000. What's wrong with the design of this trial? There's something about it that's not apples to apples, okay? Well, no matter which of those 2 treatments wins, you won't know whether it was due to the row spacing effect or the population effect or the 2 together. All you know is that one treatment yielded better than the other, but a little hard to draw a conclusion from that. Well, a better design would be something like this. Expand it to 4 treatments. 30-inch and 20-inch row spacings, each planted at 33,000, as well as 30-inch and 20-inch row spacings, each planted at 40. And with this 4-treatment trial, it allows you to better tease out the effects due to simply row spacing and the effects due to simply population, and whether or not there's any interaction between the 2 that favors one or the other. All right, here's an example of a table published in a seed company research book. This is verbatim. There's something wrong with that table. The table concludes that on average, your hybrid at 222 bushel yielded less than my hybrid at nearly 226 bushel, but there's something wrong with this table. Think about it for a little bit. If you look closely, you'll realize that your hybrid had one extra target population of 39,000 that was not listed for my hybrid. So this is calculating the averages is not apples to apples with this. So if you eliminate this extra population for your hybrid, recalculate the average yields, now the conclusion is 180 degrees. On average, your hybrid yielded not less, but actually more than my hybrid. Again, apples to apples instead of apples to oranges. Look for the comparisons. Ask what's being compared. Look for the details. Now, in the absence of statistical analyses, a replicated trial at the very least allows you to assess whether or not the treatment effects were consistent, whether they were repeatable in the trial. For example, if your hybrid consistently outyields my hybrid in every rep of the trial, even without statistics, chances are the average difference between the two is indeed significant. And I might correctly believe that your hybrid is indeed better than mine. So let me show you an example of this. Here are 3 treatments replicated 4 times in an experiment. At the top, I give you the average yields of the treatments. So treatment A averaged 160 bushel, treatment B averaged 160, and treatment C averaged 30 bushel better. So on average, treatment C yielded better than the other 2 treatments, and you might conclude that treatment C is better than the other 2 treatments. All right? But let's look a little more closely at the individual replicate data and first ask the question, is treatment C better than treatment A? Treatment C is yellow. So first rep, treatment C was in fact better than treatment A. Second rep, treatment C is better than treatment A. Third rep, treatment C is better than treatment A. Fourth rep, treatment C is better than treatment A. Even without statistical analysis, based on the consistency among the reps for treatment C being better than treatment A, you can confidently conclude that treatment C is in fact better. All right? Now, let's look at the other comparison and ask the question, is treatment C better than treatment B? It's the same 30 bushel difference on average, but let's look at the individual reps. The first rep, treatment B, is actually better than treatment C. Second rep, treatment B, is less than treatment C. All right, completely different response. Third rep, treatment B is higher yielding than treatment C. It's flipped again. And treatment 4, treatment B is less than treatment C. So even though the difference between treatment B and C is the same 30 bushels, because of this inconsistency among the reps, it's a little more difficult to conclude that treatment C is reliably better than treatment B. All right, so when you can look at the individual reps of the data, you can look for this repeatability. Statistics are doing that for us, but if you don't have statistics, you can at least look at the repeatability among the reps of a trial. So let's learn to filter the Kool-Aid before we drink it. Consider the credibility of the source, consider the plausibility of the facts, critique the validity of the data, critique the interpretation of the results, and look for independent verification of the claims. And with that, I will leave you with a thought from a mentor of mine of years ago, and remind you that you can always send me an email at the address you see on the screen. You can follow me on Twitter at that Twitter handle, and you can see what I've got on the web at my King Corn website. So with that, I thank you for watching. I encourage you to become a critical thinker as you evaluate marketing claims and information, and hope that you can improve the profitability and sustainability of your farming operation. Thank you.